The mountain always watches before any man realizes is being seen, and in the deep white silence of Alaska, that presence feels almost ancient, like an old guardian that never rushes, never explains it, and never forgives distraction. When I think back to the one many still call the coldest winter in decades, I remember the thick quiet that covered everything. It felt as if the world had paused to let the cold speak, as if the snow piling against the slopes and the wind dragging across the ridges carried a kind of truth that only the patient can hear. There was something hypnotic in that mix of brutality and beauty, a force that could humble even the bravest and most prepared soul. And right in the middle of frozen vast lived a man who wanted nothing from anyone. No applause, no validation, not even acknowledgement. He simply lived in the mountains because that was where his life made sense, and he never tried to justify that choice to anyone but himself. The first time I heard about him came from the older locals, those who had survived winters that modern folks would never believe. They spoke of him the way you speak about a rumor, true or might be madness. According to them, he kept his home warm with a strange method, something so unusual that most laughed before they even tried to understand it. They said it was a trick born out of too much isolation. Others joked that anyone who stayed alone in the mountains long enough would eventually invent something equally weird. Yet when the winter tightened its fingers around the region, the temperatures dropped far beyond what any heater, stove, or furnace prepared for. People stopped laughing. They stopped joking. And instead, they started watching him from a distance, trying to understand how his little cabin remained warm when so many others were struggling to keep even the faintest heat inside their walls. Some asked questions, others pretended not, but everyone noticed. In a storm like that, warmth becomes a kind of miracle, and the one man who seemed to possess it naturally drew attention. Still, the more his method was discussed, the more ridiculous it sounded to those who relied on machines, fuel, electricity, and all the normal tools built for surviving the cold. His approach involved none of that in the usual way. It blended old understanding with quiet observation, and that frightened more people than it impressed. Humans prefer complicated solutions because complexity makes us feel smarter. Simple ideas often feel like insults to our cleverness, and that is why so many dismissed him without ever trying to understand. When I finally met him, I expected someone eccentric, proud, maybe even offended by the gossip. Instead, I found a calm man with patient eyes and an easy way of speaking. Nothing dramatic, nothing defensive. He moved like someone who knew the land, heroic sense, but in a natural one, as if every step had long been negotiated with snow beneath it. He explained things the way some people speak to the river or to the fire, as though the world itself were the real audience. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't seem to care if anyone believed him. His peace came from a place deeper than approval. That winter was not just cold. It was an entity of its own, a force that crept between cabins and wrapped itself around trees. It whispered through the pines and pressed ice against the windows until the glass trembled. The snow didn't fall lightly. It attacked in waves. Machines froze. Batteries drained faster than they could be recharged. Pipes burst. Roads vanished under drifts taller than a man. The cold was not a condition. It was a presence. Yet his home stood there, glowing softly from within, like a small ember refusing to go out. While others fought hour after hour to keep heaters running, to keep fingers from stiffening, to keep breath from frosting too quickly, he simply tended to his routine with the same patience he offered every day of the year. On the morning, I accompanied him to gather wood. The cold bit hard enough to numb my hands inside thick gloves. The air had that metallic taste which only appears when temperatures fall long past what is comfortable, long past what is sensible. He walked slightly ahead, leaving clean tracks in the powder that swallowed our boots. Every few steps he paused, not because he was tired, but because he listen. At the time, I didn't understand what he was listening for. Later, he explained that the mountain always tells you what it needs. Snow has a sound, he said. Wind has a tone. Even silence. If you pay attention, you learn when danger is near, when warmth is leaking, when the storm is about to shift direction. But people don't listen anymore. They only react at the last moment. His trick wasn't exactly a trick, though people would always call it that. It was a way of capturing the heat that usually escapes and redirecting it so nothing is wasted. Most heating systems blast warmth in a single direction, letting the rest spill away. His system used layers, pockets, small channels carved from observation instead of tools. He had rearranged the inside of his cabin so the heat moved slowly, almost deliberately, touching every surface before fading. It was a design born from years of watching how smoke moved, how snow melted around certain rocks, how the sun warmed one side of a tree trunk while the opposite stayed frozen. Everything he built came from something he had first witnessed in nature, and that is where his genius came from. He wasn't trying to outsmart the mountain. He was learning from it. When he finally showed me the inside of the cabin, I understood why nobody else could replicate it. There was no device to copy, no blueprint, no instruction manual. The magic came from the way he positioned everything so the heat behaved like a slow river rather than a burst of fire. Even the furniture contributed, even the walls, even the floor. And he checked things constantly, making small adjustments with the same care a gardener gives to soil and seed. The warmth in that place did not come from power, it came from harmony. As the day faded into blue twilight, we sat near a small stove that radiated a gentle glow. The warmth wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't harsh. It filled the room the way sunlight fills a clearing, naturally and without effort. And while we sat there, he told me something that stayed in my mind long after I returned home. People keep trying to fight the cold, he said, as if they believe they can overpower it. But the cold is not the enemy. It is the teacher. If you resist it, you suffer. If you study it, you survive. If you accept it, you thrive. That idea shifted something inside me. We grow up believing the world is something to defeat, to conquer. But this man, living alone on a frozen slope, had discovered a different truth. The mountain is not conquered. It is understood. The winter is not beaten. It is respected. The cold is not hated. It is accepted as part of existence. As I share this memory now, I realize why so many people connect to this. Everyone has felt a winter of their own at least once, not made of snow and ice, but of confusion, loneliness, uncertainty, or fear. The world freezes around us in different ways, but there is always a path through it. Sometimes the solution others call crazy is exactly the one that keeps us warm. Sometimes the simple idea is the one that saves us. Sometimes the quiet person is the one who holds the wisdom no one else bothered to hear. If you're listening to this, maybe you too have faced or are facing a season that feels unbearably cold inside or around you. Maybe you're searching for the same kind of warmth that this man discovered on a remote mountain. And before we go deeper into his past and the reason he chose isolation, I'd like to know where you're watching or listening from, because every place carries its own kind of winter, and that changes how this story touches. Before anyone knew the full story of the man on the mountain, people were already inventing versions of his past. Some said he had come from a distant town to losing. Others believed he was hiding from something, maybe. There were even whispers that he had once been a scientist who grew tired of theories and wanted to live inside the reality he had spent so many years studying. But when I finally learned the truth from the man himself, I realized how far people stray from simplicity, how quickly imagination runs when silence refuses to explain itself. His solitude had nothing to do with escape or punishment. It was choice. pure and deliberate choice shaped by years of feeling more connected to the wind and the snow than to any street or city he had ever known. He told me that he had not grown up in the wilderness, though the calmness in his voice and the patience in his hands suggested otherwise. He had been raised in a place where walls stood closer than trees, where people stayed busy enough to forget what quiet sounded like. For years, he lived as everyone around him did, working the hours required, saving what he could, dealing with the routines that turned months into seasons and seasons into years without anyone noticing how fast it all passes. And like so many others, he reached a point where he realized he had been living a life it did not belong to, not because it was wrong, but because it was not his. He was surrounded by noise, not only the physical, the noise of expectations, the noise of opinions, the noise of people who confuse busyness with purpose. He said that the turning point came one night when he walked home and noticed he could not hear his own footsteps, not because the street was loud, but because he had grown so accustomed to the rush, the pressure, that he had stopped noticing himself. That frightened him in a way nothing else ever had. It was not fear of danger. It was fear of disappearing into a life that did not feel alive. And while most people overcome that fear by changing jobs or moving to a different neighborhood, he felt a pull toward something far deeper. The idea of quiet did not scare him. It called him. But he did not jump suddenly into isolation. He took years to understand what he truly sought. At first, he traveled alone on weekends, walking through forests, sleeping under trees. It was not an escape, but a return to something he felt he had. He learned to start fires without thinking, to find water by listening, to read the way others read Science City. With each trip, he felt the tension inside him dissolve a little more, like frost melting under sunlight. Still, he returned home after every journey, not because he wanted to stay, but because he needed time to accept the truth he already saw. His life belonged somewhere quieter, somewhere older, somewhere honest. The day he finally told his family he was leaving, they thought he was chasing a fantasy. They asked him what he hoped to find, what he expected to gain, what problem he believed isolation would fix. He said none of those questions mattered because he was not searching for a solution. He was searching for clarity. But explaining clarity to those who have never felt lost is nearly impossible. So he let the misunderstanding stand. He packed his things quietly, gave away what he no longer needed, and set out toward the north, where the mountains rise like ancient guardians, and the winters shape the soul as much as the land. He did not choose Alaska at first. He traveled through several places, learning as much from failure as from success. In one region, the land was too crowded with people seeking the same dream, turning solitude into a commodity. In another place, the climate was too soft, too forgiving, and he felt that his mind grew dull without facing challenge. It was only when he arrived in Alaska that he felt the unmistakable sense of belonging. The cold was honest, the land unforgiving, but fair. Nature here accepted no lies, no excuses. You either respected it or suffered. That kind of truth was exactly what he had been searching for. In those early years on the mountain, he made mistakes that cost him sleep, energy, and nearly his fingers during one brutal storm. He built his first shelter too shallow against the wind. He underestimated how quickly the temperature could fall once the sun dipped behind the ridge. He rationed food poorly one winter, learning the hard way that calculations made in comfort rarely survive the reality of blizzard. But every mistake became a lesson he remembered intimately. He never complained, never cursed the land. Instead, he paid attention. The mountain, he said, will forgive you once. It never forgives twice. When he spoke about his past, there was no sadness, no regret, no bitterness. He talked about it the same way some people talk about an old friend. He never described isolation as something he endured. He described it as something he embraced. People often misunderstand solitude, he told me. They confuse it with loneliness. Loneliness is the feeling of not belonging. Solitude is the state of belonging entirely to yourself. And in the mountains, belonging to yourself is the first step toward belonging to everything around you. As the winters passed, he noticed that the cold taught him more about himself than any book ever had. He learned patience when the storms pinned him inside for days. He learned resilience when tools broke under frost, and he had to improvise using whatever the land offered. He learned to listen, truly listen, to the sounds of the environment. The crack of distant ice became a warning. The hush of falling snow became comfort. The strange stillness before a storm became instruction. And slowly, he began shaping his life not around resistance, but around harmony. It was during those first years that he developed the heating method people later called crazy. It began as an experiment, a way to keep warmth inside longer without relying on fuel he couldn't always gather or buy. He noticed how snow melted unevenly on boulders, how certain hollows stayed warm while others froze instantly. Every pattern became inspiration. He redesigned the flow of heat inside his shelter based on these quiet discoveries. At first it barely worked. Then it worked well enough to reduce his use of firewood. Eventually, it became the system that carried him through Alaska's coldest winter with calm that astonished everyone who heard about it. He never intended to impress anyone. He simply believed that the mountain teaches everything if you stop trying to impose your will on it. And that idea reveals the heart of his story. He did not isolate himself because he was running from the world. He isolated himself because he wanted to live in a place where life made sense, where struggle had meaning, where he could feel his days instead of letting them pass unnoticed. When he spoke of the decision to stay permanently, he said it felt as natural as breathing. He woke one morning, listened to the quiet snow settling outside, watched slow curl of steam rising from his cup of water, and realized he no longer felt the absence of anything. The world he left behind had been loud, restless, demanding. Here in the mountains he felt whole. There was nothing to escape from, nothing to fear. His solitude was not a burden. It was a companion. People often imagine that choosing a life like his requires heartbreak or tragedy. They believe that someone must be broken before seeking quiet. But he was never broken. He simply chose a path that matched his nature. Some people thrive in cities, some thrive in crowds, some thrive in movement. He thrived in stillness, in the rhythm of winter, in the honesty of cold. And as he told me this, I noticed something in his expression that revealed more than his words. It was the look of someone who had found exactly what he had been searching for without ever needing to explain it. And perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply. It reminds us that it is possible to choose a life based on truth rather than noise, and that sometimes the world's idea of success has nothing to do with peace. Before we continue into the storm that changed everything and led to the discovery of his method, I want to ask you something simple and natural. If this story speaks to you, if it stirs something quiet inside you, consider subscribing so you can follow the rest of this journey. This man's path is long, and each part carries a lesson that might echo with your own. Life in silence is not something you understand the first time you experience it. Most people think silence is simply the absence of sound, a kind of emptiness that sits around you when the world goes quiet. But the man on the mountain taught me that silence is not empty at all. Silence full. It carries weight, texture, movement, and a kind of deep vibration that only becomes audible once the noise inside you finally settles. The first days I spent visiting him made this clearer than any explanation could have. When the wind stopped, when the fire had burned low, when the snow outside fell in slow drifting flakes, the quiet did not feel like loneliness. It felt like recognition. It felt like something that had been waiting for finally hear it. He told me once that most people fear silence because it reveals the things they usually bury under noise. When the world grows still, you start hearing your own thoughts more clearly. You notice emotions you ignored. You remember choices you delayed making, and that is why silence feels frightening to anyone who doesn't know how to be honest himself. But for him, silence was the purest companion he had ever found. It never lied, never demanded, never filled his head with voices that didn't matter. Silence, he said, was a mirror, and in that mirror, he discovered who he truly was. His days followed a rhythm that most would consider too simple to be interesting. Yet, the more time I spent observing him, the more I realized the depth hidden inside that routine. He woke before the sky brightened, not out of obligation, but because his body had learned the patterns of the mountain. He knew when the cold was about to intensify. He knew when the wind was shifting its direction. He knew the exact moment the light would reflect against the snow and enter his cabin with a pale, soft glow. He walked outside before tending to the fire, letting the frozen air touch his face as though greeting an old friend. There was no rush, no pressure. Every movement carried intention. He often said that in the silence of the mountain, purpose becomes clearer because nothing distracts you. When he chopped wood, he focused only on the rhythm of the axe hitting the log. When he carried snow to melt for water, he did it with the calmness of someone who understood the value of every drop. When he fixed the small channels that directed warmth across his cabin, he did so gently, knowing that the smallest adjustment changed the entire flow. Everything he did reflected a quiet precision, not the kind born from discipline alone. Standing, he understood. He understood his home. He understood himself. The mountain had become his teacher long before people started calling him the man with the crazy heating trick. And the lessons it gave him were not always comfortable. Some were sharp as the wind that slices across the ridges. Some were heavy as the ice that forms in thick sheets across the river. Some were subtle, like the shift in the air before a storm that only those who truly listen notice. Silence held all those lessons, and he embraced them, not as burdens, but as gifts. One evening, as we sat near the dim glow of his slow, persistent heat system, I asked him if he ever missed the world he had left behind. He didn't respond immediately. He looked toward the window, where snow was falling in gentle spirals, and then shook his head. Missing something, he explained, means longing for a life that gave you comfort or joy. But the life he had before the mountain never offered him either. It offered noise, obligations, and a sense of movement without meaning. Here, in the quiet, he found everything he thought he had lost when he was young: purpose, awareness, connection, freedom from expectation. He said that silence taught him to hear the small things that most people overlook: the faint groan of the cabin beams when temperatures dropped too quickly, the difference between the hiss of burning birch and the crackle of spruce, the sound of faraway snow shifting under the weight of unseen. He learned the meaning of each of those sounds the same way people in cities learn to recognize traffic or voices. Silence does not mean nothing is. Silence means everything is happening with clarity. One night, the temperature dropped so low that the air outside felt almost solid. When we stepped out, our breaths formed clouds, drifted upward like slow ghosts. The sky glowed with faint green ribbon, bright enough to dance, but present enough to remind us that nothing in this world truly. We stood side by side in that freezing quiet, and he told me that this was the moment he cherished most. When the sky opened its colors, when the cold sharpened the senses, when the world felt clean and unclean. He said that in these moments he could feel the weight of life lifting from him, leaving only the truth. Living in silence also meant living in complete presence. There was no past to dwell on, no future to worry about, only the immediate reality of snow underfoot, wind across the face, and fire burning steadily inside. He said that people waste so much of their lives planning things that never happen or regretting things that cannot be changed. In the mountains, such thoughts vanish quickly. You think only about what must be done now. You gather wood because you need heat now. You check the sky because the storm matters now. You tend to the warmth because your life depends on what you do in this moment, not later. The stillness of his life was not empty of meaning. It was overflowing with it. Every action connected directly to survival, connected directly to serenity. Perhaps this is why he seemed happier than most people I knew in the world below, even though he had fewer comfort, fewer possessions. Happiness, for him, did not come from what he had, but from what he no longer needed. He had stripped away everything unnecessary until only the essential remained, and in the essential he found joy. There was a day when I asked him if he ever felt afraid, not of animals or storms, of the silent self. Some people, after all, crumble when left alone with their own thoughts. He smiled at the question, not in amusement, but in understanding. He said that fear comes from expecting something from the world that it cannot give you. People fear silence because they expect it to entertain them, comfort them, or distract them. But silence is not meant to do any of that. Silence is meant to show you your true self. Once you accept that, fear dissolves. Life in silence is a kind of slow sharpening. He became sharper in his observation, sharper in his instincts, sharper in his perception of time. And yet, he remained soft in demeanor, gentle in speech, unrushed in movement. That is what struck me the most. He lived in a harsh environment, yet it never hardened. Silence had purified him into breaking him. The days flowed like one into another, each one showed weather, light, and instinct. And during this period of calm, he perfected the heating method that would later draw attention during the coldest winter Alaska had seen in decades. But the truth is that the method was only a reflection of the deeper lesson he had learned here. When you live in silence, you discover how energy moves. Heat moves like thought, slowly, deliberately, following paths you create. Cold moves like doubt, fast, invasive, slipping into every opening you leave unguarded. If you want warmth to stay, you must guide it. If you want cold to remain outside, you must understand its behavior. That simple truth became the foundation of his entire system, a system built from observation and acceptance rather than invention for the sake of invention. The man never tried to convince anyone to live as he did. He never preached solitude as a better way. He only said that silence makes everything inside you honest, and honesty, once found, cannot be abandoned. As I share this part of the story, I know some people listening might feel that same pull toward quiet, that same curiosity about what exists beneath the noise of daily life. And if you followed this far, you might find that this silence speaks to something in you too, something you have ignored for a long time. If it does, stay with this story. There is more ahead. The challenge he faced, the discovery he made, the storm that tested everything he had learned will reveal even deeper truths. The challenge arrived without warning, as most real tests in life do. It began with a subtle shift in the wind, the kind that only someone who has lived many winters alone on a mountain would notice. The man stepped outside that morning and paused for a long moment, breathing deep. The air itself were telling him a secret. Could not detect anything unusual. To me, the wind felt the same as it had the previous days, sharp, steady, cold, familiar. But he knew the mountain never changed its voice without purpose. When he returned to the cabin, he moved with a sense of calm urgency, not rushed, but entirely focused, like someone preparing for something inevitable. That day, the temperature fell faster than seemed possible. Shadows thickened on the slopes even before the sun began to set, and a strange heaviness settled over the sky. The quiet around us stopped being peaceful and became taut, stretched like a wire pulled too tight. He watched the horizon with the patience of a man waiting for a truth he already understood but could not yet see. Then he said that the storm coming our way would not be like the others, that this one carried an intensity he had not witnessed in years. He was right. By nightfall, the wind struck with force that felt like an invisible hand pushing against the cabin, pressing, testing, almost searching for weaknesses. Snow whipped across the windows in fierce spirals. The cold grew so bitter it stung even through layers of wool, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. The cabin creaked in long, low groans, as though the wood itself felt the weight of the storm. I looked toward him then, expecting urgency or fear, but instead found only focus. He moved methodically through the room, checking small structures, adjusting the wooden channels that directed the warmth, reinforcing the slow circulating system he had spent years perfecting. The storm grew louder, roaring like an ocean made of wind. The rafters trembled. Snow piled so aggressively against the door that the frame moaned under the pressure. Outside, the night had become a swirling chaos with no visible edge. Yet inside his cabin, the warmth remained strangely stable, not hot, steady, calm, reliable. It reminded me of the way his voice sounded when he explained things. Warm, never exaggerated, confident without being arrogant. In the middle of the storm, the warmth felt like a heartbeat. It pulsed through the room, slow and even, unaffected by the violence outside. Hours passed, though in such storms, time becomes meaningless. Snow hammered the roof like the steady fall of a drum, and the wind screamed through the gap in the mountains as though the earth itself were shifting. Yet he continued tending to assist, making small adjustments. Precision I did not understand. I watched him move, quiet, certain, as though guided not by fear, knowledge deeply rooted from years of observing storms like this. He said that the trick was not to fight the cold outside, but to stop the warmth inside from running away. And heat behaves a living thing. If you give it a stay, if you leave it confused. The true test of his method came long after midnight. The storm reached its peak with a sudden violent surge, shaking the cabin so hard I instinctively reached for something to steady myself. It felt as though the entire structure shifted beneath our feet, leaning into the wind one moment and resisting it the next. A blast cold seeped through a corner of the room, sharp enough to make the air tremble. I thought this was the moment everything would fail. But he reacted instantly, opening a narrow vent in the floor near the stove and gently redirecting a panel he had built into the side of the wall. The warm air that had been flowing slowly through the cabin found a new path and filled the space where the cold threatened to enter. The chill dissolved like breath on a mirror. He exhaled softly, not out of relief, but out of satisfaction, as though confirming something he had long suspected. When he saw my confusion, he explained that his entire system relied on the natural behavior of air, heavier or lighter, depending on its temperature. Cold air drops quickly and seeks the lowest point. Warm air rises, but spreads when guided. By creating narrow paths for the warmth to travel, he prevented it from escaping too quickly. Instead, it moved slowly, touching every surface as it spread, warming wood, stone, and even the packed earth beneath the floor. Those surfaces then released their heat gradually, like coals glowing long after the flames die. It was simple in concept, but required constant attention, patience, and years of experience. He told me that most heating systems fail during storms because they try to overpower the cold instead of understanding how it moves. The storm was not the enemy, he said. The enemy was inefficient. The mountain would always send storms. That was its nature. But if you learned how warmth behaves, how cold behaves, and how the two interact, you could survive anything the winter threw at you. That was when I realized the genius of his method. It wasn't a crazy idea. It was a quiet revolution built on observation, humility, and respect for the place he lived. The storm continued for nearly 2 full days. During that time, the temperature plunged even further, reaching a level that would have shattered pipes, frozen machinery, and drained batteries in minutes anywhere else. Many houses in the area lost power. Some families had to leave their homes and seek shelter with neighbors. Generators failed. Propane lines struggled. Even the most modern cabins were tested in ways they had never been tested before. Yet here, in this small wooden home on a lonely slope, the warmth remained constant, never rising too high, never falling too low. It felt like being inside the calm heartbeat of the mountain itself. At moments during the storm, I could see the weight of it on his face, not as fear, as concentration. He listened constantly. He listened to the wind trying to find a way in. He listened to the wood whispering its warning. He listened to the soft hum of warm air flowing through the paths he had designed, and each sound told him something. Each sound instructed him. The storm was speaking its language, and he understood every syllable. When the storm finally began to ease, the silence was thick and absolute, not peace like everyday silence, but heavy, like the deep inhale after panic has passed. The world outside had transformed into a landscape buried under mountains of snow. Trees bent under the weight, drifts covered windows up to their frame. The sky remained dull and exhausted, covering for its own. But inside the cabin, the air was warm enough to melt slowly. The man looked around the room with calm of someone who had expected not victory but harmony, and found it. He stepped outside, pushing the door open against a heavy wall of. The cold that rushed in was brutal, razor sharp, almost metallic, but he walked into it without hesitation, breathing deeply as though greeting an old companion. To him, the storm had not been a threat. It had been a conversation, a test of balance, a chance to prove that understanding the cold mattered more than resisting it. When he turned back toward the cabin, he said something that has lingered in my mind ever since. People think genius is loud, he said. They think it comes with pride and spectacle, but real genius is quiet. It is patient. It watches the world until the world reveals its pattern. And once you see the pattern, everything becomes simple. That winter, the coldest many had ever seen, proved the truth of his word. His method was not luck, was not madness. It was the result of years spent listening, observing, and respecting the land. And the storm, the one that tested every structure miles, proved that his so-called crazy heating trick was nothing less than pure brilliance. Before we move into the next part, where the deeper meaning of his life, the mountain, becomes clearer, and where the lessons he learned become lessons can all carry, I want to invite you naturally to stay connected to this story. If it resonates with you, if something in it speaks to your own inner storm, consider subscribing so you can follow the journey all the way to its end. Reflection comes to a man in the mountains the same way dawn comes after a long night, slowly at first, almost unnoticed, until suddenly it fills everything with a strange clarity that cannot be ignored. After the storm that tested every piece of his knowledge, every quiet truth he had gathered over the years, the man sat outside his cabin for a long time, gazing at the endless whiteness stretching across. The world was silent again, but this silence was different than the one before. It carried the echo of survival, the hum of understanding, quiet recognition he had witnessed one of nature's greatest, and emerged not only unharmed, stronger spirit. As the sun rose behind the mountains, casting soft golden light across the wide plain of snow, he said that moments like this remind us that the world does not about our struggles, but it rewards those who learn to move with it rather than against. He had lived long enough among the mountains to form thoughts that many on the side would consider strange or philosophical, maybe even too abstract for practice. But in his voice there was no intention of sounding wise, poetic, His reflections came naturally, shaped by years of watching the world without interruption. He believed that the mountains showed him truths about humanity that he would never have learned anywhere else. One of those truths, he said, was that people often confuse progress with movement. They chase goals, achievements, approval, material things with such intensity that they forget to ask themselves whether any of it truly matters. The mountain does not move, yet it changes everything around. That alone taught him that stillness can hold more power than any amount of rushing. He said that society demands constant growth, constant improvement, constant chasing of something that always stays a little out of reach. But on the mountain, he learned that growth does not always look like progress. Sometimes growth is learning to let go of the unnecessary. Sometimes it is choosing to live simply. Sometimes it is accepting that the world will not always understand your choices. And sometimes it is realizing that you do not need understanding from anyone but yourself. He spoke about the world in a way that revealed how deeply he had thought about the nature of human life. He believed that most conflicts, most frustrations, most disappointment come from trying to control things that are not meant to be controlled. People demand certainty from a world that has never promised certainty. They demand comfort from a world built on a cycle of hardship and renewal. They demand recognition from others who are too busy demanding their own recognition. But here, in the mountain, control was never an option. He could not control the storms, the cold, the wind, the season, or the passing of time. He could only control his response to them. And that, he said, was the most freeing realization of his life. He said that humans often mistake comfort for happiness. They build walls around themselves, fill their homes with things they do not need, create lives that appear full but feel empty. They chase comfort because it shields them from discomfort, but it also shields them from meaning. On the mountain, comfort is earned through effort. Every drop of water must be melted from snow. Every piece of wood must be chopped. Every meal must be prepared with thought. Every storm demands vigilance. And because comfort here is the result of presence and intention, it brings a deeper satisfaction. It becomes not a blanket against reality, but a reward for engaging fully with it. He talked about how noise shapes the modern world, not just the noise of machines or traffic, but the noise of opinions, the noise of expectation, the noise of constant information that never gives the mind a chance to rest. When he lived among people, he felt that noise constantly. It filled his head until he could not hear himself anymore. But here, surrounded by snow and wind and silence, he rediscovered his inner voice. He rediscovered the feeling of being connected not to screens or schedules, but to the earth itself. He said the world has forgotten what quiet feels like, and because of that, it has forgotten what truth feels like too. There were moments in his reflection when he spoke about humanity, not with disappointment, but with a kind of gentle. He said that people are capable of deep understanding, deep connection, and deep peace, but they rarely give themselves the chance to experience. They rarely stop, breathe, listen, and simply exist. The mountain taught him that existence alone carries meaning. You do not need titles, applause, or accomplishments. You need presence. You need awareness. You need to feel the world around you instead of constantly trying to outrun it. He believed that life becomes complicated only when we try to live it according to what others expect. Simplicity, he said, is a form of wisdom, and that wisdom cannot be bought, taught quickly, or forced. It must be discovered through patience, experience, and silence. He once told me that the greatest gift the mountain gave him was the removal of unnecessary things. When he stripped his life down to only what he needed, he discovered how little a person truly requires to feel whole. Food, warmth, shelter, purpose. The rest, he said, is noise, sky, necessity. One afternoon, He shared a memory from a time long before he ever thought of coming north. He recalled sitting at a desk surrounded by documents, phones, meetings, responsibilities that multiplied faster than he could manage. He remembered how tired he felt even after full nights of sleep, how heavy his days felt even when nothing went wrong. He said that back then he measured life in obligation, not in moment. He lived reacting, not choosing. And the worst part was that it felt normal. It was what everyone around him did. But he realized something important after he left all of that behind. Normal is not the same as right. The world can normalize misery if enough people live it long enough. That is why so many never break free, he said. They become used to being unhappy. He believed that the mountain healed something in him that he never knew was wounded. It gave him space to breathe. It gave him clarity. It gave him the kind of stillness that reveals all the hidden truths inside a man. And once he saw those truths, he could never go back to the world he came from, not because he resented it, but because it no longer matched the person he had become. When he reflected on storms, he explained how they reminded him of the storms humans fear, grief, regret, insecurity. People spend years to bury or outrun those, but the mountain storms be avoided. A storm, it is your teacher. It shows you what remains when everything else is stripped away. It reveals your real strength. It shows you what you truly value. After a storm, the world becomes clearer, and so does the heart. He said that surviving the coldest winter was not simply a matter of skill. It was a matter of spirit. He survived because he had accepted the cold long before it arrived. He had accepted the challenges, the lesson, the hardship. Acceptance, he said, is one of the most powerful forces a person can wield. Accepting what you cannot change frees you from fear. Accepting your own nature frees you from confusion. Accepting your place in the world frees you from the need for approval. As he spoke, I realized something I had never fully understood before. His life in the mountains was not about running from society. It was about returning to a natural state of being that most humans have forgotten, a state where survival and meaning are intertwined, where presence matters more than productivity, where a man stands not above nature, but within it. He believed that modern life had created a dangerous illusion, the illusion that humans are separate from the world, superior to it, in control of it. But living on the mountain showed him the truth. Humans are part of nature, and when they forget that, they lose themselves. The mountain reminded him of his place, not as a conqueror, but as a participant, and that understanding brought him a peace no achievement or possession ever had. He reflected often on the value of hardship. He said that people try so hard to avoid difficulty that they never realize how much strength and wisdom they lose in the process. Hardship, like winter, shapes a person. It sharpens the mind, strengthens the will, and reveals the hidden depths within. He was not grateful for pain or struggle in a naive way. He was grateful for the way hardship uncovered his capacity to endure and adapt. The mountain showed him that the human spirit is far more resilient than most believe. But you never discover that resilience if life always feels easy. As he spoke about the world and the nature of man, I realized that everything he believed came from observation, not theory. He had not read these truths in books. He had lived them. Every winter taught him something new. Every storm refined his understanding. Every quiet sunrise revealed something about himself. He lived with a sense of purpose that came not from accomplishment, from awareness. And as the cold wind brushed across out over he said that the world would, if people learned to listen, way the mountain, to listen not with impatience or expectation, open, to hear not only the noise, but the silence beneath the noise. He believed that silence could heal societies the same way it healed him, but only if people stopped being afraid of what silence might reveal. Before we move into the final part, where the closing reflections settle like snow over the full story and the legacy of his life takes shape, I want to invite you once more, naturally and gently, to stay with this journey. If this story resonates with something deep inside you, if it echoes your own reflections about the world and what it means to live fully, consider subscribing so you don't miss the final chapter of this mountain. The final silence of them is different from all the. It is deeper, heavier, and carries a sense of completion that you can feel even speaking. When the man sat outside his cabin on one of those rare afternoons when the wind rested, snow shimmered in the pale winter sun, there was no urgency, no sense of waiting for anything more than simple. He had lived enough days on the mountain to understand that life culminates in a single achievement or moment of revelation. Instead, it unfolds slowly, teaching peace winter after winter, until one day you realize you have become part of the place you once struggled to understand. That was his legacy, not invention, not survival alone, but belonging. The quiet around him seemed to reach far beyond the hills. It extended inward as well, settling into the places inside him where noise used. He had not always been a man carved. He had once been someone tangled in the chaos of expectation, routine, ambition, and the kind of anxiety that comes from trying to live a life designed by others. But years on the mountain had taken all of that and melted it down, the way spring melts snow. What remained was a man who had nothing to prove, nothing to escape, nothing to chase. He simply existed in harmony with the land that had become his home. He told me once that legacy is not what you leave behind in the memories of others. Legacy is the imprint of your true nature on the world around you. For most people, that imprint is faint because they spend their lives shaped by fear, by pressure, by the desire to be liked or admired. But when a person lives authentically, the world around them responds. The mountain, he believed, remembers those who live in truth. In the same way, storms etch new paths across the land. A life lived with intention etches meaning into the unseen layers of existence. What struck me most as he spoke was how unattached he was to the idea of being remembered. He had no interest in being known as the man with the brilliant heating method. He had no desire to be called wise or exceptional. Recognition was unnecessary. What mattered to him was knowing he had lived in a way that honored the land. The mountain had given him clarity, purpose, and peace. In return, he offered respect, patience, and understanding. That exchange was enough. He said that the world measures life by accomplishment. The mountain measures it by presence. A person who lives 1,000 noisy days leaves fewer marks than someone who lives 10 quiet ones with awareness. The man had lived countless such days, days in which he watched the light move of snow, days in which he tended to the fire with gentle precision, days in which he listened to the distant creak, the ice sheet spanning under the pressure of the cold, days in which nothing extraordinary happened, and yet each one shaped him into someone more whole. When he reflected on the journey that had brought him from crowded life into this solitude, he spoke not bitterness or nostalgia. He held no anger toward the world he left behind. He simply understood that it had not been meant for him. He had tried to live the life expected of, and it had weighed on him like a coat too heavy for his shoulders. But the mountain had removed that weight, not through escape, through transformation. It had stripped away everything unnecessary and left only truth behind. People imagined solitude as loneliness, but he described his solitude as fullness. He felt connected not to crowds, but to the sky, snow, the wind, and the quiet pulse of nature that moves even when everything appears still. He understood seasons as changes in weather, as changes in the rhythm of winter life. Brought reflection. Spring brought renewal. Summer brought preparation. Autumn brought acceptance. The cycle repeated endlessly, and with each turn he found new understanding. He said that Humans complicate life because they fear simplicity. Simplicity leaves no shadows to hide behind. When you live simply, you confront yourself. You confront your fears, your desires, your true essence. Most people avoid that confrontation. They fill their time, fill their homes, fill their minds until there is no space left for silence. But in silence, he had discovered a version of himself he never would have met otherwise. As the years passed, his heating system became only one of many symbols of his relationship with the mountain. It represented his belief that understanding is better than force, that harmony is better than resistance, that the world rewards those who listen. He never claimed to have invented anything extraordinary. He simply said he paid attention. He watched how heat moved in nature. He watched how cold settled. He watched the instinctive designs woven into the land, and he mirrored them in his home. That was his method. Listen, observe, adapt. He believed that if people lived their lives with that same approach, the world would feel less heavy. Instead of fighting everything that challenges them, they would learn from those challenges. Instead of forcing themselves into shapes they were never meant to fit, they would adapt to the shapes that bring them peace. Instead of seeking approval, they would seek understanding, and in understanding, they would find freedom. One afternoon, after days of calm weather, he told me that the greatest gift the mountain gave him was the ability to see the world without distortion. Down in the plains, he said, life feels blurred because people move too fast to notice details. They see the world in fragments, never whole. But on the mountain, he learned to see everything slowly. He noticed the changing angle of sunlight from day to day. He noticed how the patterns of frost on the windows told him which direction the wind had traveled overnight. He noticed how animals moved storms, how the snow settled on different slopes depending on the temperature. And through that slow observation, he learned to see himself clearly, too. Clarity is not loud. It does not arrive with revelation or shock. It arrives quietly, settling into the mind the same way snow settles on pine. One moment you are uncertain, the next you understand without needing explanation. That understanding is what shaped his legacy more than anything else. His life became a testament to the power of quiet truth. He often reflected on how people fear being forgotten, how they cling to achievement so their names will endure. But he believed that being remembered is far less important than being at peace while you live. Legacy is not what others think of you after you are gone. Legacy is the state of your soul in the final silence. If you reach the end of your days with honesty, you have left behind the truest mark a human can leave. When he looked across the valley for the last time, the day I left the mountain, there was no sadness in him, only calm, only acceptance, only gratitude. He said that everything he had learned here would remain even after he was gone, not because people would repeat his story, but because the mountain itself had changed him. And in that change, he had changed the world around him. Every path he carved through the snow, every adjustment he made to his heating system, every moment he spent in stillness contributed to a life lived with intention. Before I left, he offered one final reflection, spoken in the soft tone he used when discussing truths too delicate for loud words. He said that life becomes meaningful when you stop trying to impress and start trying to understand. When you accept hardship as part of growth. When you embrace solitude as a companion instead of a threat. When you find peace not in possessions or recognition, but in presence. He said that if more people found even a little bit of silence, the world would feel less fractured. As I walked away from the cabin for the last time, the snow crunching beneath my boots, I felt the weight of his lesson settling into me like a second heartbeat. The mountain stood behind me, vast and unmoving, yet full of a life that pulsed quietly through every ridge and valley. I realized then that his story was not simply about surviving cold or mastering a heating trick. It was about discovering a way of living that reveals the essence of being human. It was about understanding that peace is not found in the world, but within the way you move through it. And if this story has reached you deeply, if it has stirred something inside you or made you reflect on your own path, I would love to hear where you are listening from and what part spoke to you the most. Feel free to comment, leave your thought, like this story. Subscribe if you want to follow more journeys like this, and share it with someone who might need a moment of silence in their life.